Okay, welcome everyone to the latest episode of Headlines in History with me, your host, John Malik. So here we are, episode 21, and we are in another part of this mini-series on my story in Iraq, or Iraq, if you are pronouncing it correctly, as I'm often reminded. And we're coming off of the episode last week where we discussed the most tragic incident in all of our time. When we were downrange, and that is the ultimate murder of our captain, headquarters company captain Philip Esposito, as well as Lieutenant Lewis Allen. And if you want to dig into that story and get the details on how that incident made life challenging for all of us that were deployed, and how it made our story, our time in Iraq, different and unique. Because an incident like that hadn't happened and has yet to happen, thankfully, in Iraq or Afghanistan, and hasn't happened since Vietnam. So a telling story, nonetheless, about human behavior and the challenges of combat. So this episode is going to be about the environment. Okay, as I was going through the episodes and talking about what happened when we were there, I realized that there wasn't a lot of context other than the original invasion story, right? Some of the stuff that I talked about why we went in the first place. But 2005 was an interesting year because there was so much happening on the ground. There was a lot of changes, not only within the insurgency, but changes within the political system. And, it's kind of hard to understand why things were dangerous, why it was such a kinetic environment, why we were working the way that we were working, if we don't really understand what was happening on the ground. So I just want to give some context. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to talk about what the Iraqis were doing, what the insurgents were doing, and why we were reacting the way that we were. And hopefully it'll kind of put all of this story here into perspective. Okay. And so at the end of today's episode, it'll wrap everything up. I think that'll be the end of the story, at least as I've been bringing it here chronologically. And then next episode, we're going to do a bit of an extra. I've come across some thoughts and some things that have happened, or things that did happen while we were deployed, that I completely forgot about. Some funny stories, others not so funny, but nonetheless, they're things that I just forgot to include that I thought are worth it, right? So we're gonna kind of do an Iraq story extra next week, and then we'll transition back to our typical episode behavior. We'll be doing some interviews, and we'll be talking about more current headlines. We'll get back into Ukraine and Israel and those type of things. So, but like I said, I just thought it was the time to get the Iraq story out, and here we are. So, okay, episode 21. What was happening? Oh, before I do that, let me remind everybody, right? Just because I'm still in the business doesn't mean that I speak for the Army. I don't speak for the government. I don't speak for the intel community. None of those things, right? I just speak for myself. All of my opinions are my own. No connection to the government in this aspect. And anything that I talk about is clearly open source information, and you can find yourself. Also, as has been the case with the previous episodes, if you want some inside information or you feel like just supporting the show, head off to Patreon, our Patreon site, the Headlines in History podcast site. There's a donation tier there. I'd be very grateful if you did just that and sign up. $3 a month, and it just kind of helps support the show and me continuing on this journey here as we move forward. So the Patreon site, as well as headlinesinhistory.com, which is the main site. Feel free to head off to either one of those. Okay. What was happening in 2005? Well, we talked about previously was the initial invasion and the reasons behind the invasion. We talked about the post 9/11 environment. We talked about the President Bush's connection to the region. We talked about what might have been some of his personal reasons for going into Iraq. But again, generally speaking, potential weapons of mass destruction, we thought they might have been there. But again, another concern being he being Saddam, may have tried to get his hands on those weapons eventually. And in being in the environment that we were in, socially, culturally, national security environment, all post 9/11, we had thought there were bad guys all around every corner. And we wanted to ensure that bad guys couldn't have access to weapons that could hurt a lot of people. And Saddam was one of those people, right? And we also reiterated that The removal of Saddam was official U.S. policy since 1998 under Clinton. It was approved approved, but also supported by the UN. And this is not something that the United States did on their own, right? We may have gone in with limited allies, not as many coalition partners as we may have liked, because the timing wasn't perfect, but very few argued that Saddam deserved to remain in power. That wasn't necessarily the case, okay? But after the invasion, after we get into country in March of 2003, takes about a month, if you look back, 3-4 weeks in order for the U.S. military and our allies, the Brits were in the south, handling Basra, but the Americans eventually made it to Baghdad, and we got to the point where you saw that famous video where there was an American flag thrown over the top of the Saddam statue in Baghdad, and that was quickly taken down, as it should have been, and replaced with an Iraqi flag, right? We're not interested in taking over Iraq in any sense, right? Simply just establishing a security environment and transitioning it to the Iraqis. It's clearly their country, and that was a bad look on the U.S.'s part, but remedied quickly. Nonetheless, took about 3 weeks rather, to get to Baghdad and make that happen. So the question is, after you get to Baghdad, what do you do? Right? Somebody has to step in and fill a power vacuum, because ultimately the government, those that were in charge of Iraq in 2003 prior to the invasion, were all Saddam loyalists. He wanted it that way. Everybody in the military was potentially a Saddam loyalist. At least they were on paper. We'll talk a little bit about that and how that varied by person. But nonetheless, at least on paper, if you were in the government, you were tied to Saddam. If you were in the military or the intelligence services, you were tied to Saddam. And so the United States and the UN and others felt like, well, that's not the best entity to remain in power and transition to a future Iraq, an Iraq with an Iraq that's for the Iraqis, by leaving the individuals once in charge still in charge. So the United States came up with, and international partners came up with, the Coalition Provisional Authority, so the CPA. And this was an entity that was, if you will, commanded, and I'll use the word command because there was a singular person in charge, and that person, being L. Paul Bremer, had authority, plenary authority, meaning he could make decisions within Iraq for Iraq without having to receive permission from the White House. Now that's not to say that clearly he didn't get that's not to say he didn't go back to the White House or go back to the State Department and have advisors and other things. I mean, it came out that he was kind of acting on his own. At least that's what some people had thought, because the White House didn't have the capacity or the experience or whatever to give him advice. But that's for a different argument, a different political argument, really. But anyways, he had unitary authority and he can make decisions on his own. Again, but he was surrounded by advisors. But this entity took control, right? And they said, all right, we're in Baghdad now, and we need to ensure that we can rebuild infrastructure. We can get the power back on if it was out. We can get the water running. We can keep food flowing, right? We want to make sure that Iraq can, after this 30 days-ish of combat, that it could be turned back on, if you will. If it can just start rolling back into a day-by-day, schedule, if you will, so we can get this process started of figuring out who's going to be the government, right? What's going to happen. So the Coalition Provisional Authority took over when we first got to Baghdad. Then shortly afterwards, so this is in April, right, when the CPA took a few weeks to kind of get its feet under itself and establish some security cordons and determine where L. Paul Bremer and his staff was going to stay and which palaces and all this stuff. Eventually, just a few short weeks later, in July of 2003, the CPA established something called, I want to make sure I get it right, the Iraqi Governing Council. Okay, and this was a group of 25 people, 25 Iraqis. And again, I want to make sure I list this the right way. There's 13 Shia Arabs, 5 Sunni Arabs, 5 Kurds who are different ethnically but were Sunnis, so they're again different ethnically, but they were Sunni in their religious outlook. right? One Turkmen and one Assyrian, because it's not just Arabs and Kurds who live in Iraq. There's a whole host of other people, like other large countries with millions of people who live there. And 3 of them were women. First time this had ever happened, anybody with any real authority in Iraq. So that was really the first step. That was the first sign, if you will, that the future of Iraq was going to be different, that they were building right off the bat with this first governing council, that right off the bat we were going to have a variety of citizens involved in the decisions for the future of Iraq, to include women, which was a great decision. But there were some poor ones that the CPA made, but a good decision nonetheless to start things off. And their job was to work together with the CPA. Now they had to listen to the CPA in some sense, where they couldn't make decisions amongst themselves on the council without getting approved by the CPA. What the CPA's concern was that the governing council would somehow slide directly into some authoritarian type government, would eradicate any potential democratic values. As a matter of fact, one of the decisions that they made was to try and establish Sharia law across the entire country, which would have, again, we would have worked backwards a little bit in terms of equality with women and other things. So that was something that was, those were the hurdles that the CPA was trying to avoid. Right. I mean, that they didn't want to establish an Americanized or any British-led or Australian-led government and say, this is how we do it, you're going to do it this way. What they wanted to do, and they did do, is at least build a foundation and say, Iraq, you can do whatever it is that you want to do, as long as it's in a representative format and in some type of democratic format. Everybody's going to get an opportunity to play. This is not going to be the way that it was under Saddam. It's not going to be the way that it was under the Kings. It's not going to be the way that it was under the Mandate back to World War I. This is going to have everybody playing a role. What that role is and how it works out, that's on you. But everybody is going to play a role. And so they also had the responsibility of appointing some cabinet ministers. They did that. They had to appoint some administrators to the UN, so the UN could be informed on the process that was taking place in Iraq, which was, a good idea. International buy-in here. Iraq affects a lot of other countries in the world. And they also had to write, and this is a big deal, they had to write the transitional administrative law. So what this was colloquially called was like the temporary constitution. They had to establish, this group of 25 had to establish a set of laws that was going to govern Iraq until the permanent constitution could take effect. I mean, first of all, they had to write it, but eventually take effect. And they had a plan. They put a plan together, a scheduled plan, if you will, to say, so the CPA is here, the governing council is here, then we want a date where there's going to be an interim government, and then we're going to have a date when there's a permanent government. And this original group of people were the ones that were tasked with doing this. The next big milestone, and I'm building this history here so you have an idea of what it was like in 2005. If you don't know this political history, you're going to be challenged. It's going to be challenging to really kind of grasp what was going on in 2005. So anyway, so the next big scheduled event politically, if you will, was about a year later when the Iraqi interim government took hold. This is in the summer of 2004, or June 2004. And they were established based on the original governing council. And their job was to take sovereign control over Iraq. And they would be in control, in charge, in the way that the temporary constitution stated, that was originally created by the governing council. And they would be temporarily in charge of Iraq politically until the Constitution was ratified and then took hold. And so the reason this was a big deal was because this was the day that the CPA left. This was the day that the Americans and the British and all those that were part of the CPA and the UN were saying it's Iraqi sovereign governance now. Pay attention to the schedule and the plan you've already created. Go on and do great things. But now Iraq is a sovereign nation. And it's no longer, quote, occupied. Now, let's address occupation really quick. So this is a legal term, and I've watched some videos recently as I was preparing to do the episode, remind me of some of this stuff that L. Paul Bremer gave, L. Paul Bremer the third, to be technically accurate, that Bremer gave discussing the word occupation, and we need to be reminded that that was the legal term. Now, the UN had said that they recognized the U.S. and British occupation of Iraq after the fall of Saddam in March of 2003, until such time that the country could be, again, transitioned to an Iraqi government. And so there's a lot of discourse over what occupation means and if the Americans were really occupying, and no one really, from an American perspective, a Western perspective, nobody wanted to be seen as being the occupiers. It's a charged term, but technically it was the legal term. So that's why you'll see technically the occupation of Iraq on a lot of official documents. It wasn't just, it was technically the legal description. So anyways, the transition, it was technically June 28th, 2004. That was a big deal because, again, that now Iraq is Iraq, right? They were controlled by the Iraqis, rather. Then the next big hurdle, the next big date was 30 January 2005. And this is just after we got into country. So if you remember the previous episodes, I said that we left New York. We had the issue with the Christmas and whether we were going to go out right after or whatever, New Year's. Right, and then we landed in Kuwait in 3 or 4 January 2005. Eventually got on the C-130s and the GAC, and we made it up to Iraq. And it was later on in January. So right when we were there, initially there, getting ready to, as I said before, right seat, left seat ride. As I was, me specifically, was sitting with my counterpart, another sergeant, who was teaching me the ways of how they were doing analysis at that time, and I was getting ready to sit in the seat and take over for him, that we were coming right up on the 30 January elections. And these elections were the first time you would see some of the pictures that came from, the pictures you'd see in the media of Iraqis with ink on their fingers, because these elections were countrywide and they were parliamentary elections. These elections were designed to create the legislature that was originally created under the process of the temporary constitution, that they had to create a legislature, and the legislature was then going to author the official constitution. And so really, when we came in the very beginning of 2005, it really all started. All the temporary stuff, all the temporary decisions about what was going to happen during the transition from 2003 to Iraq kind of happened in 2004 before our time. But in 2005, this was whatever we decide to do now, and when I say we, meaning the Iraqis, whatever we decide to do now is going to be the end of our decision-making, right? This is going to turn into the new Iraq and going to be permanent. And so the elections that did happen throughout the time that we were there in 2005 were a big deal. And the first thing that was a challenge, again, was this 2005 in the end of January, because legislative elections, they were everywhere. They were all over the country. That people coming out from districts all over the place. And the first big hurdle that we had to deal with, well, let's say the leadership had to deal with, both at the Baghdad level, so the 3-star level, and all the division commanders and their State Department counterparts, was that the Sunnis, the vast majority of the Sunnis, had decided they didn't want to participate. They were angry at what happened in 2003. They had felt like their power had been taken from them. A lot of it had. They were angry that Bremer made the decision to disband the military early in 2003. Now, he argues, Bremer, that the military disbanded on its own, and that the Americans just accepted the disbandment, right, and then didn't call them back. That was an American decision to not call the military back after it had run. But nonetheless, all of those Iraqis were now without work. They were paid in some way, and there were complicated ways that they got some money, and some of it was even more than what they had under Saddam. But nonetheless, a reoccurring paycheck was not coming because the military was gone. And the same thing with the Ba'ath Party. The decision by Bremer to eliminate the Ba'ath Party as a non-legal entity put a whole bunch of other Sunnis back on the streets without any jobs. And, the challenge there is, what do you do if you're a leader like Bremer at that point? Are you going to allow the Ba'ath Party to stick around, knowing full well that it was once under the control of Saddam and there's a whole bunch of loyalists involved? But in the same way, it would be like keeping the Nazi Party around in Germany, right? Like just the fact of the title, regardless of who's involved and whether Hitler's gone or not or any of those, no post-war political body, I don't even care if it's in Germany, is going to accept the fact that you're going to we'll just keep the Nazi Party. It wasn't their issue. It was just a Hitler issue. It's not happening. Just the optics alone is a problem. And the same conversations and the same decisions came up in Iraq in 2003. Are we going to keep the Ba'ath Party? Just the optics alone seem like not a great deal, or not a great idea, rather. But the problem is, much like it was the case under the Nazi Party in Germany, most of the people, or let's say a good majority of the people that were part of the Ba'ath Party, were just regular people. The only way to get anywhere in Iraq was to, if you were a Sunni, was to be part of the Ba'ath Party. And you didn't necessarily have to like Saddam. Sure, some did. But you just wanted to make a paycheck to feed your family. So there were a lot of disgruntled people who were literally, they were telling the Americans directly. They were either approaching them on bases, or they became, part of the insurgency and were arrested. And then when we were asked why they were fighting, they would say, I don't even like Saddam. I just want a job. And you guys took all of our jobs away. So this led to the January 30th parliamentary elections, where the Sunnis were fed up. A lot of them were fed up. That's part of the reason. The other part of the reason is they were being influenced by outside entities. You had the beginning of the rise of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Zarqawi was a real concern. He was still alive in the very early part of 2005. And he was warning Sunnis that if they participated in the process, not just Sunnis, everybody, but Sunnis included, if they participated in the political process of Iraq, that they would be killed. They would either be taken hostage and thrown in rivers, or they'd kill their family, or whatever it was. And it often happened. And so the Sunnis were angry and afraid at the same time. And so we had a very, very low turnout in the end of January. The elections, from a tactical perspective, were challenging. I mean, I remember sitting and looking through the locations. I remember seeing an Excel sheet, right, of every single polling station that was designed that was going to be operational at the end of January, and trying to devise an assessment for the bosses as to which ones were the most important, but at the same time, how can one be more important than the other? I guess you could look at it and say, well, there's going to be more people at this one, so that one's potentially more important. It's a higher priority and it requires more security, but at the same time, it can't be more important because everybody voting is important. And anyway, so we went through this whole analytical process. There just weren't enough people to guard every single polling station, at least from an American perspective. We didn't have enough soldiers. So, which goes back to that whole conversation we had in the first couple episodes about the modular brigade construct and not having enough people in Iraq. But nonetheless, we didn't have enough to look at every single polling station. So I remember there being tense days and nights prior to the elections. First of all, reading the intelligence reporting that they were going to be targeted, and that the Sunnis were likely not going to participate as much. And we had a real challenge in trying to protect as many people as we could, and it became a pretty violent day. But nonetheless, overall, I would say it was successful, and I think that would be a fair claim. It wasn't the way we would have wanted it to turn out in a perfect manner, but it was successful. Again, generally speaking. However, the Sunnis not participating did create a problem. What that meant was now the legislature had so many Shia and Kurds, so few Sunnis involved in the constitutional creation process, that the Sunnis then later on in 2005, when decisions were being made and the Constitution was being written, this was all happening while we were there, they were mad because they now looked back at their their poor decision in January saying, well, we're not going to participate. This thing potentially could just fall on its face. And if we don't go, it'll never happen. Well, it happened. And when everyone decided, or when the legislature decided to start drafting this Constitution, there was a bunch of stuff in there. No need to get into details, but just a bunch of stuff that the Sunnis didn't like. They wanted more authority, and they're kind of being put in their place. They're only 20% of the population percentage in Iraq, and were being treated as such. And they had very little way to push back because they weren't involved, right, on any large scale. And so that just inflamed the insurgency even more, because the Sunnis, again, who decided not to participate, now they're getting mad as the Constitution is being written. Now they're getting, and they still don't have jobs. So now they join the insurgency if the insurgency is funding them, which, by the way, they were being funded. And they found a way to get out their anger. Their anger was on either the government that was being created, the interim government at this point, or the Americans who were, and the British and the Aussies and everybody else who was there to stand up this government, to help the government stand up, rather. And so, but we got through the elections in 2005, in January of 2005. And then the next big hurdle, at least from an election perspective, was October of 2005, that's when the Constitution would be ratified. There was a referendum that was going to be had, that whatever was created starting in the beginning of January and worked on all through the spring and all through the summer, the Constitution had to be eventually presented to the Iraqi people. And it wasn't just going to be the legislature who decided what the Constitution would look like, even though they were a quasi-representative body. They wanted a full referendum. That was a decision made by the interim government. They wanted all of the Iraqis to have a say in whether the Constitution would be was good enough to be the permanent new government in Iraq. So there was another massive election, if you will, or at least a voting process that happened in October of 2005. So we went through the same process, and how many people were going to show up at all these polls, and could we do a better job keeping all the polls safe in October, any better than we did in 2005. And the struggle there was that the insurgency was just getting stronger. And I mean that like on a whole, right? So, there were groups like Ansar al-Sunnah and Ansar al-Islam, and then there was Al-Qaeda in Iraq, even though eventually Zarqawi was killed, that his group that he had started continued to get stronger and stronger. And then you had Muqtada al-Sadr, who we'll talk about in a couple minutes. He was on the Shia side of the house, being supported by Iran, trying to bring down the whole concept, getting the Americans out earlier than anybody else really wanted from an international perspective. And so it was busy, right? And again, from a threat perspective. And I remember, I'll give you some context here. So we had 4 provinces, like I said, that we were overseeing when we were there. So it was Kirkuk, Sulaymaniyah, Diyala, and Saladin. And, we had a running tracker, of course, the entire country did, as to how many attacks occurred every day. We would categorize them by what they were, whether it was a small arms attack or whether it was an IED or a vehicle-borne IED or a suicide vehicle-borne IED or an indirect fire, all these different categories, so we could try to use the data to help us in the counterinsurgency fight. And if I remember correctly, there was like an average of 30-ish, right, every day in our 4 provinces alone. So every single day, 30-ish like attacks happen. Whether, again, that could be a small arms attack, somebody's shooting an AK-47 at a convoy in Bakuba, which was or Bakoba, depending on how you want to pronounce it, down in Diyala province, or whatever. Somebody shot some 107 millimeter, Katyusha rockets at a FOB. That would be an attack. 30 a day in all of these provinces. And during the election season, I remember us counting and looking at how many attacks we would have every single day, because the environment was just different. People were, the insurgents, whether they be foreign fighters or the insurgents that were part of the former regime or Iraqis, that they were trying to disrupt the process. There were so many more targets available, whether they be politicians running for office or polling places, that the attacks spiked. I mean, we're talking 120 to 130 attacks a day, or 4 times more, depending on your math. It's just a lot. It's a lot. And then once the voting process would conclude, then the attacks would find themselves baselining back out, if you will, into what we thought was a baseline, or what we accepted as our baseline in '05, which was again about 35-ish, something like that. Okay, so now you have in October, we have the constitutional referendum, so a voting process. Now we're getting towards the end of our tour, and the constitutional referendum in October would then set the stage for the permanent government to take over in 2006. Okay, and the goal there was for the government to take over in May of 2006, and then that would be the newly established permanent government that had been devised and developed through all of these steps in '03 and '04. And again, a lot of the voting, at least the constitutional referendum vote and the legislative vote, happened when we were in country. And one of the challenges that wasn't tactical, but was something we were tangentially involved with, at least on the strategic level. When I say involved with, I mean like helping to add color and context and reasoning to our analysis to the bosses on why attacks were up or down, or why certain attacks were after certain people, was because a lot of the Iraqi people were frustrated at the process because they didn't understand it. Even though I tried to, in the last 10 minutes, break down all of these changes from the CPA to the governing council to the interim government to the temporary government to the constitutional referendum and then the permanent government, if you look at it long enough, you can kind of get it to make sense, especially if you look at all the details, you figure it out, write a book, you can read the book, and you understand it. From the everyday Iraqi, and this is in no way designed, this is in no way me saying that they didn't have the capacity to understand. They just didn't have the experience. And so, if you live in a country, if you're 50 years old and you just have a family and all you've ever known is either the Saddam's leadership or, the president prior to him, who was really kind of like a king, acted almost like a monarch, if you will. There's some democratic stuff involved. But nonetheless, the Iraqi people weren't involved. They didn't have local elections in that way. And, the elections that were held under Saddam were all nonsense, and they were all fake, and everybody knows that. He was like North Korea's elections, where he gets 98% of the vote. It was, it's folly, right? It's silly. There was nothing to think about. All of this other stuff, you had to think, and particularly when it came to the Constitution. And I remember so many intelligence reports coming in where local Iraqis were talking about how they were a bit hesitant, but nonetheless open-minded on some level to try and understand what this whole new government concept is going to be. And they had to do this by reading through the Constitution and then like determining whether they agreed with it or they didn't. And it just wasn't, how do I explain this? You had to do it. So if I say something like it wasn't fair, I don't mean to say it in that manner. It had to be done, right? The Constitution of Iraq had to be created, and a government had to be created. We couldn't just not do it, right? And at the same time, you wanted as many Iraqis to be involved as possible, of course, but you ran into the challenge that the overall, generally speaking, the general populace just didn't have the experience to deal with it. So it was like being stuck between a rock and a hard place. You knew what the right thing to do was, and that's have everyone participate. But everyone couldn't participate because they didn't understand. So a lot of people would either try and understand, but most didn't. Most just said, I don't. And it's, a lot of them were women too. Again, has nothing to do with their capacity to understand, but they were never placed in a position for a long time, and many women for their entire lives, right? Placed in a position to have a say. And so I remember, again, a whole host of intelligence reports coming through that women were just simply like whatever my husband says, right? So their husband is just going to grab them and say, hey, it's voting day and we're going down and we're going to vote. And, and off they went and they voted. It was, they did whatever their husband had said. And again, it has nothing to do with the capacity. It's just simply a different culture. It's a different society and they have a different experience. But nonetheless, so, the Constitution eventually was ratified and the new permanent government took over in 2006. But so I guess my point in saying all of this is that this was the backdrop of the story of 2005. right? There was, there's like, there's many stories, if you will. And the Army, the military often calls them campaigns. There are campaigns inside of the greater war. And there are actually 3 separate campaigns. If you, we can all wear, those of us that went to Iraq, we can all wear a campaign pin on top of our Iraqi Freedom Service Medal if you happen to be in country during one of the campaigns. And it just so happened we were. The first one was the invasion. The second one was, if I remember this correctly, the second was the political process, and then the third was the surge post 2005. And if you were there during those times, then you get to wear one of those pins. And so all 3 mini stories have different, have different effects on the overall war. Clearly, defending polling stations is a very different process than when General Petraeus was in charge and in command during the surge. And it was also very different than establishing a security presence in April of 2003 after the initial invasion. These are very different missions and very different end states, right? Different goals. Either way, so that was the backdrop of 2005. And it was pretty kinetic. As I look back on some of the data, it's, even to this day, that there's an official DOD number, and then there's the Associated Press has their number, and but nonetheless, there was about 840 Americans killed in 2005, which was just around the same number as 2004. Believe it or not, it was like 840-ish in 2004 as well. So take a look at, do the math on those numbers, and then you'll see how many Americans died on average per day in Iraq in 2005. Generally speaking, or comparatively, that is a low number if you're to look at other wars. But again, every single life matters, and we don't want to explain it in that way, right? You lose one soldier, that's a problem clearly for that soldier and their family, and that's a very, very big deal, right? But comparatively, it's low. If you just to look at today, the Russians are losing on average 35,000 soldiers a month in Ukraine. That's World War I like. Now, not all of those are killed. This is a combination of killed, wounded, and missing. But nonetheless, 35,000 casualties per month in Ukraine right now that the Russians are suffering from. So if you're to take the total number of Americans who had died, wounded, well, we don't have any missing, but died or wounded in our time in Iraq, it's significantly lower than that. But nonetheless, when you compare it to not having anyone die, and you're sitting in country in 2005 and you're getting the reports every day and they're coming across your desk and you're comparing how many, if we got the number, how many Iraqis died, how many insurgents died, how many foreign fighters died, how many Americans died. It's a lot when you're looking at them every single day. And it's devastating when you hear things like, equal on both sides. We would hear things like, the Americans found 40 bodies, right, in the Tigris. Because the foreign fighters had gotten a hold of them, and these reports would come out afterwards that these people wanted to participate in the new government of Iraq. So they were just slaughtered, literally just slaughtered like cattle and then thrown into the river, right? And you get that report that comes across your desk, and 40 people were just found dead, And then you'd have this massive truck bomb where we called, again, a vehicle-borne IED, and it destroys some building or and 15 Americans are killed at once. It was, it was a lot. And it's, one of the sobering things that I dealt with in the last couple of weeks is I was looking through some of this stuff. Again, I was researching again some of this political stuff to make sure I had it right. And I was looking back at some of the statistics and looking at, again, some of these events that occurred. It was, it's jarring. 34 Iraqi boys were killed by a suicide bomber in July of 2005. 35 Iraqi boys, children, by some suicide bomber. 173 people were found in a bunker at the end of our tours, November of 2005, just outside of Baghdad, in a bunker. mutilated, starved, 173 people. Just there they are. We had no idea where they were, right? And eventually they were found. Yeah, the insurgency, the Sunni-led insurgency, and the foreign fighters who were being either the Shia foreign fighters who were being sponsored and financially supported by Iran, and the Sunni foreign fighters who were members of Al-Qaeda or similar groups were really working hard, particularly in 2005, to disrupt the political process and make Iraq look like chaos. And they did that by not only targeting Americans and those that were helping to provide the security structure, but the people participating in government. So the first interim president of Iraq was a guy by the name of Iyad Alawi, and he had a long-standing relationship with the United States, and he was known to multiple administrations as a moderate Shia who clearly anti-Saddam and somebody that would likely be a good leader for Iraq in the post-Saddam era. And he had, a strong relationship with the United States. And it's not surprising that he became the first interim president after the CPA was dissolved. And, he was very brave, right? And as were, the people that worked for him in the cabinet, the temporary cabinet members and senior leaders in the political process in the legislature, because, eventually in the legislature when they formed in the beginning of 2005, because constantly they were being attacked. There were assassination plots all over the place because the whole point was to try to eradicate anybody who was working in the system, to try to stoke fear and ensure that people wouldn't get involved and that they wouldn't run even for local mayor of the town all the way up to the president of Iraq. And that was and they were successful in a lot of ways. Strategically, they weren't successful because Iraq it's its own country today, right? So ultimately they failed. But nonetheless, during the process, they were winning tactically because there were plenty of people who did not participate, that would not go to polling places, that would not run for the local mayorship because they didn't want to die. They didn't want their kids to die. And it was a rough time. You might be thinking, what are the tactical ways, the insurgency was, what are some of the tactics that the insurgency was using against Americans and others? And 2005 was interesting because when combat first started in Iraq, well, first let me say this, that the Iraq insurgency was different than the Afghan insurgency. And I think I may have mentioned this earlier, but it was different in that Iraq had access to real military munitions. Right? There were a lot of 152 rounds hanging around Iraq, which are Soviet-made, because Saddam and prior governments had relationships with the Soviets and the Russians. So, and their whole military was constructed on the Soviet ideology. So they had Soviet weapons, they had T-72s and all that stuff. All of their 90% of their weaponry was all Soviet. So they had a lot of Soviet munitions. And so the IEDs were these improvised explosive devices that were put on these roadside bombs, they say in the media, these that were put on the side of roads so convoys, when they drove over them, would explode. They would be often constructed by these munitions. Where in Afghanistan, there was a lot of fertilizer-based IEDs because Afghanistan did not have the warehouses of munitions in their capacity, in their hands in 2001. The Taliban just didn't have that. First of all, the Taliban used a lot of their weaponry during the Civil War, starting in 94, all the way up into 2001. And the Taliban just wasn't Iraq. It wasn't as large as Iraq. It didn't have the money. It didn't have the finances that Iraq had. Iraq had the fourth largest army in the world at one point. 25 million people lived there, which is very different. So they had more stuff, right? And they could use that military grade stuff in their insurgency. And in the beginning, it was all wire detonated. Okay, there were wires connected to the rounds that were put on the side of the road, and then somebody, almost like a Claymore mine, as I discussed in the last episode, then a wire would be run all the way back off the side of the road, and then they would hide under the sand or something, and then when somebody came by, they'd press a button and it would detonate. Now, the challenge with that is, one, you need a lot of wire. First of all, you need a lot of rounds, but nonetheless, you need a lot of wire. And then the wire because it needed to be set up oftentimes in a hasty manner, because you can't be out there digging around all the time. And if you did dig, then oftentimes you left a trace that you were there, that the wire became a problem. So, not only does the wire leave a trace visually, but, the United States had some intelligence collection capabilities, LiDAR and other things that we could detect if they were using wireless, put it that way. So the insurgency then transitioned into a remote-based insurgency where they were using cell phones. And they were saying, okay, well, now I don't have to, I'll find somebody to teach me how to put this receiver on top of these combined rounds here on the side of the road, and I'll be on the other side of the bridge. And once I hit the button on the cell phone, then boom, it goes bang, right? So how does this benefit? One, you don't need any wire. Two, you could also have a larger standoff distance, because typically wire, unless you have a lot of it, right, you got to be close enough. You can only go as far as your wire has, right? Now, if you have a remote-based IEDs, you still have to have eyes on in some capacity. You still have to be able to see when the convoy is coming down the road and then press the cell phone button at the right time. But again, your sight restrictions they're less of a restriction, if you will, than the wire. Well, the Americans then countered those measures with electronic warfare, okay? And so there were a lot of times that I remember that insurgents were pressing cell phone buttons, and as the convoys went by, nothing happened because there was enough electronic warfare in order to block that behavior. So they kind of shifted back into wires. They started running wires over bridges. So it wasn't that when the Americans got used to looking at wires on the ground and constantly scanning all over the place for earth that was disturbed and wires that were running wherever they were running, that they would start putting them up again over bridges and running the wire above their head. And so once an antenna, a radio antenna or something else that was sticking up on the top, a turret often, because Humvees often had turrets on the top with 50 cals or something close, a SAW, a 249, that they would detonate. So, again, that's still physical. And so the Americans were able to counter that. Then we got into the pressure plate IEDs. And this was a real challenge for the United States and its allies. And it happened in 2005. This is when the increase in the pressure plate use was used. And this we had made the assumption, and I think it came out that it is the case, and you can do your own research on that, but that foreign entities had helped the insurgency within Iraq use these pressure plate tactics in order to get around the wire and the remote. And they would just put together two pieces of metal. They were all constructed differently, but the concept remains the same. They would put together these two pieces of metal, and they would bury the metal underground, and then they would cover it up. And then once the weight of the American convoy drove over the pressure plate, the weight would push the two pieces of metal together, creating a circuit powered, and then therefore it would detonate. Now you'd think to yourself, well, that's silly, because it's one thing to dig a wire. That's going to create just a little bit of disturbed earth. But if you're going to bury the whole IED, or at least the initiating mechanism, the two pieces of metal in some way, that's going to create even more disturbed earth. Well, first, they don't have to be large pieces of metal. So, and second, the pieces of metal are buried under the road itself, because it has to run under the tires have to run over top of this thing. So it's a lot easier to cover up disturbed earth in the middle of a road, right? So because there's just a lot of traffic on the road. Obviously, if you have disturbed earth off the beaten path, it's easier to find if something is disturbed because nobody drives over there. And some people walk, but nonetheless, just not as busy. The roads are busy. And so if you could find a time in the middle of the night or whatever when Americans weren't driving around, or other Iraqis, or if you could influence the Iraqis to keep their mouths shut that lived locally, then you just put the pressure plates under there, you run over, and that was that. And then that became a real challenge in the counterinsurgency fight, because that was hard to detect. And that was, you can't see the wire, and your electronic warfare capability isn't working, clearly, because there's no remote detonation. So we had to transition to this to almost a the counter engineering assets that are used in counter mine warfare in conventional combat, where you'd put this rotating metallic device large on the front of a Humvee or some of the larger vehicles, and then they would rotate and create pressure on the road. And then if there were any pressure plates, that eventually it would hit that before the vehicle ran over, and it would cause a lot of damage to the front of the vehicle, but hopefully not as much damage to the rear of the vehicle or the middle. So soldiers were protected. So just an interesting back and forth and how the insurgency went. And all insurgencies are the same way, right? There's a spy versus spy like concept. There's a, I'll be better, you'll be better, and we're just going to kind of one up each other until we can get this thing figured out. And that certainly was the case when it came to pressure plates in 05. And also 05 also saw the increase in what we called explosively formed projectiles. And we had known that this was a particular capability that was brought into country by Iran, supporting the Shia militias that were running around in Iraq, again, trying to cause chaos and kick the Americans out, particularly related to this guy named Muqtada al-Sadr, who lived in a place called Sadr City, just south of Baghdad. And but nonetheless, so they created these explosively formed projectiles, which were made out of metal, as you might imagine, but soft enough that once the device, it was like a tube that had the soft metal on the top, once it was detonated, that the metal on the front of the tube that was pointed towards the adversary would literally use the force of the explosion to transform from something that was flat or convex into a pointed weapon, into a pointed bullet, if you will. And because of the design, because of the makeup of the metals, that those explosively formed projectiles were defeating the armor on our Humvees and our other vehicles, even tanks, pretty easily. I mean, definitely easily. I mean, certainly easily on Humvees, not so easy on tanks, but nonetheless, and they would at times go right through the middle of a Humvee. It was pretty devastating stuff. The advantage with EFPs was that there weren't a lot of them. It was difficult. They were difficult to make, required a certain amount of expertise, and a certain specific types of material that not everybody could get their hands on. Again, in Iraq, if you found the right bunker, you could find a whole bunch of 152 rounds and use those for IEDs all day. But EFPs were not the case. But again, that came in 2005, and so there was a real fear. There was always a fear with soldiers driving around. But when those EFPs came out, it changed the game in a way, because with a soldier driving around on the streets of Baghdad with typical IEDs, that you think you got a shot, right? Your armor is getting better and better as the months go on. The vehicles are getting stronger and stronger, and so there were increasingly times when IEDs would go off and soldiers would be okay. They would be obviously mentally rattled and they would be wounded at times, but we weren't losing soldiers. Soldiers weren't dying as rapidly as they were in early 2003 because our tactics got better, and the one to protect against these large munitions that were laying all over the place, these 152s, sometimes 155s. But the EFPs changed the game because we knew there was very little protection. If you ran over an EFP, if you got hit with an EFP, there was nothing, very little was stopping that round. And so it really did kind of change the mindset of soldiers in 05. So, all right, so let me give you some further context, and then we'll wrap this thing up here. We've been going for a little while here. Some polls were conducted in and around the later 2005 timeframe. 82 to 87% of Iraqis wanted the U.S. gone. 47% were agreed with actively attacking Americans. Polls are what they are. But nonetheless, 47%, even if it's 40, right? 4 out of 10 Iraqis supported attacking the United States. And there were a lot of reasons other than, quote unquote, the occupation. Abu Ghraib was a disaster in 2003 that caused a whole host of problems. It really supported or supplied the insurgency with more fighters and a stronger ideology when pictures came out of American soldiers stacking prisoners, naked prisoners on each other. It was a very bad day for the Americans and our allies in Iraq, nonetheless. And the foreign influencers, Iran being one of the most important and the most prolific, was a challenge. I mean, we couldn't go into Iran. We knew Iran was supporting the insurgency both with munitions and financing and expertise, and so it's like Cambodia and Vietnam. What are you going to do? And it's the same thing with Pakistan and Afghanistan. If you have a support center that your fighters can go and relax, they can get more munitions, they can get more funding, they can get more training, but the counterinsurgency can't go there. We're not going into Pakistan and Afghanistan. We're not going into Iran. And when we did at one point go into Cambodia, that was a disaster in Vietnam. And so we had to deal with that the whole time. And as long as that was there, it was like a no-win scenario. No-win scenario for the counterinsurgency in 2005. But let me leave you with the transition here as we were getting out. So, and there was another big event that happened and really heartbreaking for us in the Rainbow. So at the end of our time, I told you we got in there in January. We transitioned with the 1ID, and General Batiste was the commander. I remember specifically because I had briefed him. And the 101st came in, and I don't recall at all who the commanding general was so we were closing down Fob Danger, and we were getting ready to move. Well, the Army, let's say, was getting ready to move the division headquarters to Camp Spiker. So clearly when we started, it wasn't at Spiker. Spiker was just another location where we had a lot of air assets and Air Force folks, and the division headquarters was at Danger. Well, as this war was going on, the Americans had to decide which FOBs were going to be reduced because we were going to eventually reduce the amount of Americans there. And so Fob Danger came up on the list of, okay, let's get the division headquarters out of here, get it over to Spiker because eventually we want to close Danger. And so what happened was it just so happened at the same time that the 101st Division was coming in and the 42nd was leaving, that the new occupation was happening, that Spiker was taking over as the division headquarters. And so really the vast majority of the 101st came in and they went right to Spiker, and very few members came to Danger. And so it was a very different experience for us, right seat, left seat with the 101st than it was with 1ID. 1ID was 100% in, and the 42nd was 100% in. But coming out of country, the 42nd's looking to get out of there, and the 101st is over in Spiker doing their thing. Now, I can't speak for the generals, and I'm not going to speak for the chiefs of staff, and how their transitions went. I don't know. I heard plenty of rumors that it just didn't go all that well. But I can say from an intel perspective, we didn't have a lot of right seat, left seat. There were very few soldiers that we interacted with. We sent a few over to Spiker. I remember there being a limited number. Their leadership was like, we only need 4 or 5 of you folks and whatever. So nonetheless, it was very different. But tactically, I remember one of the main locations within our purview that we were trying to protect was the something called the Golden Dome down in Samarra. The Al-Askari Mosque down in Samarra, a Shia mosque, very prominent. And for a long time in our rotation in 2005, there was intelligence coming in that Zarqawi in particular was looking to destroy the Golden Mosque because he thought that would be a tipping point to turn Iraq into a sectarian hellscape where Sunnis would be attacking Shia and Shia attacking Sunni and would make things even worse, and the whole thing would come crumbling down. That was his plan. And so we put a lot of effort into protecting that key terrain. We definitely labeled that as key terrain, a priority for all of the locations within our 4 provinces that needed to be protected. And unfortunately, when we left in late 2005, just when the 101st took over in February of 2006, the mosque was destroyed. Now, it was it was damaged rather heavily, and that event led to, or helped to lead to, exactly what Zarqawi wanted, and that was a sectarian hellscape. And the Shia were like, "That's it, the straw that broke the camel's back. We're going after the Sunnis. Any Sunni is fair game, because they're all the same, right? And they're in their mindset, they're all the same as this Zarqawi Sunni who hates all these Shia, and we can't put up with this anymore. And so, whatever. And then you ended up turning into this an even more devastating and dangerous environment, which eventually triggered the surge in 06 and 07. But that was hard for the 42nd to accept when we got home. I remember looking at the news, and of course you spent 10 months in Iraq. When you get home, you're still into it, right? You're still paying attention and what's going on since we left and whatever. And in February, you're like, oh, they blew up the Golden Dome, and it's like, geez, you know. Now, I'm not making any claims that was the 101st's fault by any means. That would be silly. But nonetheless, it was under our purview for a long time, and it didn't take long after we left for that to change. So I just remember that being just a crappy day, you know, aside from all of the Shia that died and all the people that, you know, all the innocent people that died, of course, that's all important. And, you know, all the people that died afterwards as a result of the sectarian civil war. But yeah, that kind of sucked. But anyway, so we transitioned with the 101st and we came home. And I remember it being around wintertime. Same thing. You kind of get yourself out of Kuwait. There was no ground assault convoy in the same way. At least we didn't treat it in the same way. A lot of us flew out. I flew out and made it back to Kuwait. And you spent a couple of days in Kuwait out processing admin, paperwork, all that kind of stuff. And mailing things home. We would mail a bunch of stuff home so we didn't have to carry it. And because, you know, you kind of accumulate things while you're deployed, either mail people send you or stuff you buy on the internet, because we were lucky enough to have stuff mailed to us from Amazon and things like that. Nonetheless, so you make it back to Kuwait, you're there for a few days, a week, whatever it is, and then back to Fort Drum, and it's over. So, okay, so we've gone a little long. That was the contextual environment to 2005, heavily related to the political process and eventually the sectarian fight that came. But Zarqawi was running around and everyone was attacking polling places, and it's just a real challenge. But thankfully, Iraq got it figured out, permanent government, and there's a lot to be done. It's sitting here even in 2024. Iraq has its own issues. There's still a lot of Iranian influence. They're working through it, and but what they don't have is Saddam Hussein, and so that's a win-win. I would make that claim. So, okay, now last episode on the series coming up next week. I'm going to talk about some of the things that were some stories from Drum and other places, that just to kind of wrap this whole thing up and make sure I get it all out. And just a few stories I think would be just to be fun to chat about, and I just kind of be remiss if I didn't get them out there, because I did miss them. So don't forget, podcast with Ian Bick coming out. I keep saying it every week. You're probably thinking like, what's going on here? But it's going to happen, I promise. So I'm going to link to Ian's show in the show notes. We're working diligently on our preparation for my podcast episode with Dark History, my buddy over in the UK. So that's going well, and you'll see his link in the show notes as well. And I'd be remiss. I reiterate, if anybody would like to donate and be a part of the process to keep the show going, then head off to Patreon. That'd be great. Headlines in History, and you can find me at headlinesinhistory.com. Find me on my YouTube or Instagram sites. Same thing, Headlines in History, and check out some of the clips I got up there, and all connects to the show. So thanks for coming again. Have a great week. I look forward to seeing everybody next week when we wrap this whole thing up, and then we'll get back into our traditional way of doing business. So have a great week.